Hello, and thank you for choosing this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel to support me. I would really appreciate that. And now, on to the talk. Hello, and welcome to the Cloud Therapist channel. I'm Richard Simon. This is the December 2023 edition of Cloud State of Play. This is going to be a bit of a review of the year 2023. So we'll be just kind of going through some news items that we've covered and also highlight some new stuff that's come maybe our way that we picked up on as well. It's become a bit of a tradition to do this for the December episode. And I think we did it last year as well. We were in suitably Christmas attire last year as well. So we've kind of carried on that tradition for this year as well. Yeah, so we're going to have to hopefully kind of go through a number of categories. Before we do that and talk to you about the categories, let me introduce you to a man who requires no introduction.
Hello, Richard. How are you?
So see, I didn't make an introduction, so that's good. We moved on to the next part of the discussion straight away.
I believe it's a year, more than a year we've been doing these things now.
Indeed. I think everybody should know you, but just for those who are tuning in for the first time ever, you have, first of all, a lot to catch up on. And then the other person I'm speaking to is called Paul Bevan. Paul is the Director of Infrastructure Research at Bloor Research. So welcome back again, Paul. Good to see you.
And you. Yeah, very good. And I'm thinking, God, my name's out there now. I'm in trouble.
There's no going back now. You've got like a year and a half of humiliating episodes and whatever. People can look up. You're forever immortalized digitally. So there you go. Are you ready to go? Shall we talk about the categories?
Yeah, why not?
Okay, cool. So we did this last, and I think the categories were kind of sort of broad enough for us to be able to sort of cover a multitude of sins under each one and sneak in some stuff that we always wanted to mention, maybe forgot to mention or didn't have time to mention throughout the year. And also it allows us to kind of focus on certain areas. So the first of the categories, there's 5 of them. So the first of the categories is mergers and acquisitions. So what's been the latest kind of who's been buying who and things like that and how those things have gone. Number 2 has been kind of outages. So major outages, they could be some service, they could be cloud, they could be whatever. The third one is innovation. So what's been kind of favorite or most interesting innovation that we've seen for the year? Could be really kind of business related or tech related. The fourth one is cloud winners and losers. So specifically focusing on cloud winners and losers there. And then the fifth one is kind of a tech update. So kind of what's been maybe an interesting technology that's come along the way that we might have picked up on recently. So again, we'll go through that. Okay, so let's move on to the first of those, which is the M&A, mergers and acquisitions. So Paul, would you like to kind of go through the ones that you had in mind?
Yeah, I just wanted to revisit very quickly without sort of going into too much detail. So 3 key ones that are one that actually started last year and is really sort of finalized this year, which is the VMware Broadcom type. OpenText taking on MicroFocus and also the Cisco and Splunk one. So to me, the reason for sort of picking on those 3 is that they are at a very specific part of the mergers and acquisitions market, which is, where 2 very large organizations get together. And the question is, does that ever really work? And they always try and portray it as some sort of marriage of equals, and the reality is that's never the case. So I fear for VMware, and in the sense that the Broadcom culture is very, very different, and the VMware people are already starting to feel that. I think with the latest pronouncements from Broadcom that says you've got to get back to the office. And VMware people, I think, who've been used to being much more, home-based, have been basically told if they live within so many miles, 50, I think it's 50 or 60 miles of the office, they're expected to be in a number of days a week. So I don't think they've gone completely bad, but it was interesting that, real clash of cultures. But the thing I wanted to bring up more than anything else is these are very complex things to put together. Culture is one, lots of different technologies, and I don't think they ever really work properly. I mean, if you look at OpenText and MicroFocus, that's an interesting one.
Yeah.
If you go back 15 years, probably more, MicroFocus was a small, software company based in Berkshire, and it started to grow by acquisition, and it took this sort of large swathe of HP sort of systems management software and to try to tell you. And they've really struggled over time to leverage that into something really coherent. I think that's the problem. It's making it coherent, and therefore, I fear for OpenText being able to take all the bits and pieces of Microsoft and do something with them. A lot of the time, of course, it is just seeing how much value they can extract rather than, growing the whole. So I just think those. So the Splunk one is interesting in the sense that there's an obvious synergy there between Cisco and Splunk, in the sense that in the sort of IT operations space and sort of networking space, data has become more and more important, and therefore it's logic to them getting Splunk. But again, it's two quite large organizations, trying to marry cultures, and from a Splunk perspective, Splunk have been sort of outflanked and outfought, if you like, by some of the newer data companies coming along. So I think you forget that Splunk is a reasonably old, in sort of cloud terms, organization that predates the cloud. People think, oh, Splunk's really modern, but it's actually been around quite a while in modern technology terms. And therefore, Cisco aren't necessarily getting something that is cloud native or particularly up to speed with some of the latest developments. Don't get me wrong, I think Splunk is good, but I don't think it's the be all and end all. So you look at these major mergers and think, actually, do you add value in these? And you'd have to look back over history and say, for the most part, one side or other gains something out of it. But is it, do you double the value of the whole? Do you, get that? And I don't. So there's been a number of those. Plus, of course, at the other end of the market, companies buy smaller companies to get over the sort of 2-year development gap that they get caught out. IBM classically have been sort of going on a spending spree for Apptio, NSI, Polar Security, and each of those is areas which they've been slow to react, and they've got 2 years of development to catch up, and therefore they buy something. And does that work? Sometimes, but actually to the detriment of the brands that they pick up. You fear for the small brands that an IBM picks up, because you lose a lot of the value of that. So I think it's interesting. I mean, we're seeing lots and lots of M&A activity, but it tends to be those two sort of polar opposites. Never mind the quality, feel the width type approach of the big boys. How much I put in there, and then this, oh my goodness me, I've dropped behind the race. How do I jumpstart something in a particular area? And I never think these are particularly successful. It's interesting.
I mean, for me personally, the kind of the ones that you mentioned, my comments are the Broadcom acquisition of VMware that was only completed, by the way, in November of this year. We did cover it, so if anybody's interested in kind of knowing more about it, we covered it in the July and December episodes of Class State of Play from last year, actually. It's kind of strange bedfellows, I have to say, for that one. And the interesting thing that I found with that is, at least for me, and anybody who's seen more news about this, please let me know. Drop a link in the comments. But I've seen very little kind of discussion about kind of how it goes. Yes, I've seen a couple of articles that say, yeah, it's now kind of completed and is going to go maybe in this direction, or Broadcom's going to do that. I have seen there was a report about job losses at VMware, about 2,500. Apparently, I don't know what division, where they're from, how accurate that is, but that was something that I did pick up on. And it was, it was just kind of that, that clash of, sort of markets, I think, the sort of where Broadcom is and where VMware are. And so that's going to be maybe something we'll look at again in a year's time and see how they've kind of fared over 2024 or something.
They're very different. And I got one interesting insight this year, I think, as we've gone through the year. It's not one insight, just as we go along, is that Cisco's, one of their previous acquisitions was Thousand Eyes. And it was interesting when that first happened. As an analyst, I immediately switched from, we had quite a good relationship with Thousand Eyes, but not a lot with Cisco.
Yeah.
So, we were talking to Cisco people, and it all changed. The atmosphere changed, the whole approach changed. They were starting to drop things into App Dynamics, which is part of their brief, and suddenly Thousand Eyes was being touted everywhere within Cisco, without anybody thinking what on earth it did for them, and the Thousand Eyes people move into the background. It was interesting. Give them about a year, and now we're back to where we were. We're now dealing directly with Thousand Eyes. They've absolutely made it clear that they're not an observability platform, which is where a lot of it was going. And so sometimes if the company doing the buying is sensible, they can actually get the most out of this. But quite often you see what happened in the early days between Cisco and Thousand Eyes being just carrying on, and so it destroys the culture of the smaller one you buy. But actually it can work. So to an extent, kudos to both the sort of Cisco management and the Thousand Eyes people for working their way through that one. I must admit, I feared for it when it first happened.
Yeah, and again, that you mentioned observability, as we've, I think, noted in a previous episode of Classic Play, there was this jumping of the bandwagon that happened probably 18 months ago now, 2 years ago, something like that, where, you had people kind of in Splunk who were sort of doing that sort of search and things like that. They're very good at that kind of query stuff and, querying lots of machine data, as they called it. Because I went actually on one of their sort of half-day courses, and it was really fascinating. And kind of, did the practical of Splunk and everything, and that was really fascinating to do. And then you had people like, Turbonomic, App Dynamic, and then the whole sort of, MoogSoft and Datadog and Dynatrace and so on. So they were all kind of, somebody was doing sort of machine data, somebody was doing AI ops, somebody was doing APM, or application performance management. Somebody was doing, observability, just straightforward observability. And they all realized after a while, hey, these are just terms. We can just do all of them. And then they kind of all got, so you started seeing like Splunk about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, started to talk about observability. Hey, you can do your observability with us. I was like, well, no, hang on, you were like machine data. You were kind of more query and search. You weren't kind of real time and, things like that. Whereas, people like Dynatrace have always been, for example, in the observability space, but not necessarily in the APM space or the AI ops space. And then all of a sudden you saw them talking about AI ops and APM and, machine data and things like that. It's like, oh, okay, everybody's doing everything now? All right, I didn't know that. So
as an ex-marketeer,
yeah, the tricks.
I know the tricks, and as an analyst, you know the tricks that they get up to.
So there's a lot of that kind of, I think, backtracking, and I think with the Cisco acquiring sort of Splunk, the question for me is kind of what's going to happen to App Dynamics. Because like I said, they're all in this space. They're all kind of merged their capability, or at least they're claiming that's what they do. I don't know if anybody's kind of leading in that space, or kind of doing more in one than the other. I really don't know.
No, I mean, I think we can park this from a review perspective. I don't think Splunk and App Dynamics will merge into some sort of one single area. We'll come back to that, because I think it's to do with data rather than the application performance management. What they're looking for is the data management capability you get with Splunk.
Okay, well, let's see that. But having said that, it does go back to what I was saying, and I did coin a term which, strangely enough, nobody's picked up on. Maybe it will still come back next year. Who knows? Cloud network management. So that was something that we talked about. There was a company called Aviatrix, I think, which was doing a really good job, I think, in that. I saw a demo from them in AWS Summit in Berlin or something like that a couple of years ago. And they were doing a really good job. I think we mentioned cloud network management as a kind of, a converged sort of space where, you are actually doing cloud networking management type of stuff. And you should have been doing this a long time ago. So maybe kind of Cisco is, aiming towards that as well, with the Splunk acquisition. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's closing the visibility gap when you get to the cloud, for enabling people to pull together that end-to-end visibility. I'm not going to use the term observability there, but the ability to see end to end. And obviously it's moving towards, how do I ensure and assure end user experience, which is all well. Okay.
Yeah. Now on the OpenText acquisition of the British success that was MicroFocus, regardless of what you might think of MicroFocus, I think what they did they did it very well. It was perceived, I think, as kind of the unofficial sort of title or tagline was, where software goes to retire, was, I think, the title of kind of what they, how they did things. And that's what they were kind of really good at doing. And as you said, they acquired companies. I was working for SUSE at the time, so they acquired the whole sort of Novell, SUSE kind of thing. So we were part of MicroFocus at the time. So we saw this whole sort of period of when they bit off, I think, more than they could chew with the HPE software division, software group acquisition. And I think what happened there was, this was one of those so-called spin merge, I think, type of acquisitions. So it was a $8.8 billion, which equates to about 6.6 billion pounds, spin merge acquisition. It was more like a reverse takeover, really. Or at least that's what it sounded to me. Sounded like to me. MicroFocus paid HPE $2.2 billion. I don't know how kind of they managed to, total that to $8.8 billion, but that seemed to be the kind of the figure that was put out in the press. And yeah, it felt like a reverse acquisition, really, from my perspective. And the problem I think that MicroFocus had was that they, it started, I think, it was announced in 2016, completed in 2017, and it had failed by 2020. Clearly, they were struggling to digest that acquisition of the HPE software division. And I think the reports said there wasn't a great deal of information out in the public, but they said that MicroFocus was struggling with the in-house systems that the HPE software division had in terms of integrating them and making them work as a kind of one unit, basically. So basically merging them with their own systems internally. So it wasn't necessarily oh, nobody's going to buy this anymore because now, or we're not going to buy anymore from this HPE division because now they're part of MicroFocus. It wasn't kind of a customer or public perception problem, but it seemed to be like an in-house, technology issue that they struggled with.
The HP software website, going back just prior to the merger, absolute nightmare for partners, nightmare for customers to find anything on. and it was too many individual product silos, nothing, really pulled together.
Yeah.
And it had just grown topsy, and trying to navigate your way through that to give yourself a chance of understanding what you could buy from HP, the software division, was really difficult. I worked with a small, software sort of operations management type environment that spent a lot of its time doing HP work.
Yeah.
They used to despair of the sort of the right information, from a just marketing perspective.
And let's not forget the autonomy thing that HPE had just prior to that, a few years before that as well. So there's a whole legal stuff going on with autonomy's leadership allegedly cooking the books for autonomy and kind of hyping it, making it more than that it was actually worth, and so on. And I think that was part of the acquisition as well. So it's like get rid of that toxic bucket as quickly as you can, as far as HP was concerned.
HP were clearing the decks for their sort of move into sort of private and hybrid cloud type.
Yeah.
And yes, where software goes to die is probably slightly unfair in one sense, but probably true. And therefore, you're managing decline.
That was the internal.
Managing decline is always a problem. So I still fear for the OpenText MicroFocus piece, because I just think OpenText has maybe bitten off more than it can chew.
Yeah. Okay, so next one along, because we've got a couple more to mention here. The Microsoft and Activision / Blizzard acquisition. Ooh, I saw that. I saw that reaction. So this was a $68.7 billion acquisition from Microsoft, which equates to around 54.8 billion pounds. It was completed in October of this year. We mentioned it in the December edition, I think, of last year, Class Data Play, but also we went through it a bit more in the May edition of this year, 2023 Class Data Play episode as well. I think this is probably the most protracted and arduous kind of thing that I've recently come across. I'm sure there's been a lot in the past, but this is probably the most kind of painful one that I've seen. All of the merger and acquisition government bodies, so the Competition and Markets Authority, or CMA in the UK, I had to look this up, the Directorate General for Competition, or the DG Comp of the EU, and the FTC, I believe, is the Federal Trade Commission in the US, all rejected it at the beginning. But they were not the most vocal. The most vocal was Sony Computer Entertainment, SEC. SCE, Sony Computer Entertainment. So Sony obviously make the PlayStation video game console, were probably the most vocal, and they were kind of making the most protestation. Interestingly, the likes of Ubisoft, which is also quite a large, or Electronic Arts, for example, also very huge players in the game space, and they kind of do lots of title releases and development and so on. I didn't hear really a great deal from them, certainly not on this sort of the gamer line and sort of gamer web, if you like. There wasn't really a lot of kind of discussions around from them, but Sony, I think, was the most vocal, and I agree, quite rightly so, to a degree, in terms of the probably the most leading title, the most important game of Activision and Blizzard makers, the Call of Duty series. That's a huge franchise, been around for a long time. I think the Modern Warfare was the last one that was released in November of this year. And I think the lifetime, I dug up some information. Thank you, ChatGPT, for the help. I did dig up some information on this. The lifetime sales for Call of Duty have been around 425 million copies of Call of Duty games so far. So that's, I think, up to the previous release, not Modern Warfare 3, but the previous release of Call of Duty. So that was quite a big an acquisition. I think pretty much everybody disagreed, and I think even Microsoft was being sued by gamers in the States when they announced the acquisition. I don't know if that lawsuits are still going on, but everybody was really against this acquisition. So Microsoft has to. There was a lot of pushback at the beginning. They hit back on this sort of the UK and said, well, we're just going to, I remember you and I think, discussed this, and they said, well, we're just going to pull out all our assets from the UK, which was kind of absolutely ridiculous. I think that actually brought on even, worse criticism, against them in terms of what they were doing. The FTC then sued as well. I don't know if that's still going on. It might still be going, but they and some US gamers actually sued them. And then eventually Microsoft, made some compromises. So the 10-year deal with Nintendo, the online gaming, so the cloud games, streaming games part of the business went to Ubisoft. That's a 15-year deal. Apparently, I didn't know actually how long it was, but I dug up some information on that. And they also, because Activision also owns people like King, who make the mobile games like Candy Crush Saga and stuff like that, on Android and what have you. Those are huge games, mobile games. I think there was a restriction from the CMA, certainly, and I think also the FTC, that they can't really invest in each other's IPs either. So Microsoft can't just give like $1 billion to the King team and say, hey, just produce the best Candy Crush Saga next version of that game that you can, or something. So this kind of pocketed sort of acquisition, if you like. And obviously the gaming part of the streaming games part of the business, the cloud streaming part of the games business, went to Ubisoft as well.
Yeah, it's interesting for me. It sort of brought out into the into the daylight, if you like, the amount of lobbying and sort of background work that goes on with governments, and that's some of it slightly concerning. And how powerful are some of the big hyperscalers, the big software companies becoming, and how much influence do they have over government policy? I'm sure when we get around to talking about AI, it'll sort of some of the things that have happened in the last few weeks around AI will be interesting. But for me, it brought out that sort of continual battle between tech companies that don't want to be restricted in how they operate, and actually governments trying to do the right thing. That sounds very very noble, but fundamentally ensuring that you don't have such a level of monopoly power that it becomes a challenge and a problem. And seeing it more and more.
Yeah, and there's like this clash as well of ideologies. The business is kind of saying, well, what's the problem with me buying somebody else? What's the problem? They don't see the problem, or they see the problem, they kind of just ignore it. And then on the other side, you've got the government bodies who don't really know the business. They're not really kind of clued up about games and stuff like that. They just kind of look at it as a business acquisition, but they don't kind of maybe understand the intricacies within that particular market. It doesn't have to be games, really anything that happens. So that's, I think, there's like a clash, I think, of ideologies. Excuse me, there. And I think the other issue, which not even Sony has mentioned, and I kind of thought about this myself, is so next time let's say Sony releases the PlayStation 6. Now, when you release a new console, what you want is as many so-called launch titles as you can that come out on the same day, the first day of release of the console. You have some games to play. That makes sense, right? Okay, but what maybe people don't understand or kind of don't necessarily appreciate is the fact that the likes of Sony provide software developers like Activision, like Electronic Arts, whoever kind of they're partnering with, as well as their sort of obviously in-house development teams, kind of pre-production or beta models or even alpha models, so like emulators of the next generation of the video game console that they're going to release, right? So they give these months in advance, right, to these software or games developers, so they can start experimenting, getting the graphics right and understanding how the architecture works and things like that. Now, you can imagine with the PlayStation 6 coming out, how is Sony going to give that early pre-production console to Activision and avoid the Microsoft Xbox guy walking past that Activision developing going, oh, is that the PlayStation 6 beta model? Yeah. And then, so that I can see that sort of situation, and maybe Sony has thought about this. Sony, if you're wondering about that, maybe you can hire me and I can figure out things like that for you. But anyway, so point being is, that's what I thought of immediately. That wasn't necessarily kind of mentioned anywhere, but that sort of thing happens. And I'm kind of, being a slight gamer, I've been sort of in the background of this and kind of seen all of this sort of stuff happen. I've even seen some of the pre-production models and things like that people have, these console makers have actually, produced in the past. So I think that was kind of the thing for me. Never mind the billions of dollars and the concessions Microsoft's had to make and the being sued and stuff like that. They can handle all of that. But for me, it would be things like that, because those software houses, those distribution house software houses, have to sign NDAs, with Microsoft. They have to sign NDAs with Sony. They have to sign NDAs with Nintendo, and obviously they used to do with Sega when Sega made consoles as well. And so they could then have these consoles for months in advance, start developing their games, and hopefully the games will be ready on launch day. So there'll be a launch title, so to speak, so that the maker of that games console is not relying solely on in-house developed games on day one. They actually have some third-party support as well. But in order to do that, you have to give that console, probably a year, 18 months in advance. And it will be in the form of like a software emulation, then a very kind of, wires sticking out kind of alpha, and then it becomes a beta, and it's somewhere between a board sitting in a very powerful PC, and then eventually you get like a console, right? And that's how the development normally goes. But anyway, so that was just something interesting that I picked up on. So.
Some of your passions coming out there, I think.
Yeah, well, it's like I said, it's it's an interesting thing, and you and I have been following the whole saga for the year. So it was just interesting to see about that.
And one of the words that keeps cropping up in these, people want lock-in, and actually, if you make it difficult for people to go anywhere other than, let's say, the Xbox, because of what's happening. So I think a lot of the mergers and acquisitions, authorities were looking at that and going, hold on a minute, there's going to be awful lock-in, so I think it's not good. But then you come back to this: is the hardware, is the actual controller, is the PlayStation or the Xbox really just a piece of commodity hardware, which is
true. True, there is that. I do concede that, and I recognize that.
Consumer markets are slightly different than the business markets when you come to that sort of perception of what is a piece of commodity hardware, because there is a lot of support, if you like, amongst consumers for particular platforms.
Yeah. Okay. So the two that I wanted to surprise you with, one you've I think beaten me to it, which was the IBM acquisition of Apptio. So that was a $4.6 billion acquisition. That's in the cost management and FinOps space, is my understanding. So say no more about that. But I did ask ChatGPT for these, and ChatGPT was very great at actually highlighting them. The other one, which was interesting that it highlighted for me, was a company called, or an investor called, San Francisco, let me get this right before I get sued. Francisco Partners acquired Sumo Logic for $1.7 billion cash. So that was a very quick acquisition. It was announced in Feb and completed in May of this year. And apparently they've taken them private. So they're off they removed the stock from NASDAQ. I have no idea what's going on there. That's all I know. But I just thought I'll mention that one.
And we might want to sort of, just look forward into 2024.
Not too much, because we have our projections. Don't forget.
That's what I mean. And we'll come back to that because I think there's a data story going on there.
Ah, okay. Right. Cool. All right. I think we've spent enough time on M&A. So let's move on. Outages was the next one. Now, we mentioned in the July episode, I think, about British Airways, we kind of questioned whether British Airways is an airline that's held back by its IT systems. The mobile app, apparently, for British Airways, I think I probably suffered from that, went down in May of this year. There was the whole Waypoint crash that happened on the 25th of May. There was a lot of short-haul flights that were cancelled in regards to that as well. And the Waypoint issue, I think, although sometimes, people explain what the problem is or what happened, but it's still not really an explanation of why it happened. It's kind of how it happened, or the way it happened, or something like that. So maybe the circumstance leading up to it. Because I know somebody in that sort of airline space, and I did ask him, a good friend of mine. I said, "Do you know about the Waypoint thing?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "So what's the industry saying about it?" And he said, "Well, it's just what you read in the press." He didn't know any more about it either. But the problem, I think, seemed to be that two waypoints of the same name were input into the system, and that confused the system. Now, I would have thought that your error handling would be a little bit better than crashing the whole thing, or sort of just stopping working and needing, kind of just losing the plot completely. But what do I know about airline software?
They said at the time that it was, quote unquote, vanishingly rare for this sort of thing to happen. And it brings me back to an awful lot of the outages you see. And when you get down beneath it, there's a real inability of probably most people, I'm not going to, point fingers, to do proper risk management on these things.
Right.
And you say, yeah, it may be vanishingly rare, but if it happens, it brings the whole system to a halt. You'd better do something about it. Whereas, they spend far more time fixing the easy things that happen over and over again.
Yeah.
Then they can go, "Oh, I fixed that. And so there's an awful sort of sense that people look at those vanishingly rare occurrences and say, I can ignore it. And it's never going to happen. And you think, yeah, but what are the implications if it does? And that was absolute classic.
Yeah. And for me, it's also, yes, you are catering for and dealing with the ones that you kind of maybe expect to happen or are relatively obvious to happen. And you can say, well, we haven't had a crash for the last 10 years. But that one singular one that you didn't accommodate, or for some reason it just seemed to be impossible to think about, might actually set you back those 10 years in terms of, okay, so you haven't lost any money, you haven't cheesed off any of your customers for the last 10 years, but that just one clash could cost you the 10 years of downtime that you may have had, with other types of events and incidents, as well as, the goodwill of your customers. I
mean, sometimes those vanishingly rare occurrences require huge amounts of backup capability that people just won't spend the money on because it's so vanishingly rare that it actually happens. But in the Waypoint case, you looked at it and think, well, actually, if your testing was better, and if you used more regular static data testing rather than relying on the real world, or it's not happening, just do that. And maybe AI will come back, AI will raise its head again that says, actually, you may be able to automate this process, because it comes back to human error.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Now, the hyperscalers, all three of them, we're not going to leave anybody out, all had downtimes, lots of outages for this year. So everybody, I think, seemed to be struggling, I think, shall we say, with that. Now, interesting report I picked up from a company called, I've never heard of them, but a company called Parametrics Solutions, with an X at the end. Parametrics Solutions. They estimated in their report that downtime costs users $100,000 per hour. So that's obviously an average, but that's quite a substantial downtime. And some of these howlers have gone for days, certainly hours, but some of them have actually gone on for days. And a typical outage, again, I think this was from the Parametric Solutions report, an outage for AWS, a typical outage, could cost in total $3.4 billion as well in terms of revenue lost. And not to leave out kind of those singular vendors. So I think Salesforce had an outage as well as Slack. Slack had it in July, October, November, and the recent one was in December as well. So maybe they'll get an award for most downtime or something. I don't know.
I mean, if you look, I mean, I know you've looked at the Thousand Eyes outage reports.
Yeah.
And I've sort of spent some time sort of digging into those. And for me, the thing that sort of comes out is that actually the network and the internet and the cloud networks themselves are now so prevalent, and you can work your way around problems and an automated sort of rerouting of things. The networks aren't causing it. Where you're seeing most of the outages is in the back end systems. And again, what's happening is that normally, I say normally, quite a large percentage of them are happening after there has been a software update or a software change, a configuration change, and so again, it's you look at the cloud and sort of internet systems that are out, web-based systems are out there, they're very reliable, but they're not necessarily very resilient to being messed around with. And it's that messing around when you update that's causing the problems in the back end, that actually the networks themselves, despite us all getting slightly hot under the collar about, Russian submarines blowing up network, cables across, and those sort of things. The number of alternate routes are available means that network outages tend not to have major impacts because there's so many route rounds now. What's having the impact is the back end systems. So, and again, you come back to, will AI help with that? In terms of better code quality, we can have all those sort of debates. Will automation help because everybody's trying to go too far, too fast? And automation will improve that. But that's where the problems are coming. They're coming in back end systems.
And I would say maybe a step back further from that is the architecture of the software as well. Are you really using kind of modern techniques for when you push out updates to your software? I doubt it very much, because that can certainly in a cloud environment, with A/B testing, blue green, and all that kind of other canary and what have you, all those kind of other ways of releasing software, you can certainly overcome those sorts of issues. But it just depends on whether your architecture, your software is architected in that sort of cloud native way. So the other one that was also a outage was Cloudflare. Cloudflare and Workday apparently had very similar at the same time kind of outage in early November. Seemed to be power related. I don't know what it was, but again, I that caught my eye.
One of the things you have to look at with that particular one, it's a learning curve for enterprises, I think, is to understand the relationships between the various cloud service and internet service and network service providers. Who uses what, what other service, the peering that goes on, the moving across networks, using particular elements of another vendor's or another service provider's architecture or services, means that you can think, well, Cloudflare has gone down, why is that affecting Workday? Until you look at it, see how much Workday uses Cloudflare infrastructure. So again, there's this whole issue that I've been addressing with some end users around, it's software as a service, is up to them to meet their SLAs. And you go, yeah, but if you want network assurance and if you want assurance that it's the whole thing's going to work, you need to take part in this as well. Yeah.
And there was, I think somebody CRN did like a top 15 outage as well. Try and include the link for the for that report in the description. I think Thousand Eyes also have their own sort of report as well. I think there was they talked about the Workday peculiarity about the Workday and Cloudflare outage as well. So we'll go to that.
Yeah,
okay.
That blog is good because it does all the monthly updates on that. So
right. Okay.
Worthwhile putting up.
Cool. Thank you for watching this long video. I really appreciate it. And you're still watching it, which is fantastic. Please feel free to check out some of the previous episodes of Class Data Play, as well as maybe checking out some of the other talks on the channel as well. Bye for now.